Welcome to False Market Value, a podcast featuring real conversation about fictional sponsorship in movies, TV, books, music, and other pop culture. I'm your host, Ross Kennerly, founder of Quant Sponsorship Consulting in Las Vegas. This episode is produced by DJ Cruiser from KSD Studios out of Fort Mill, South Carolina. As it turns out, just 35 minutes away from Charlotte Motor Speedway, which is the setting for the deal we're talking about today. Our guest for this episode is my friend, colleague, fellow sponsorship valuation dark artist, co-founder and principal of ADC Partners, and host of the podcast One-on-One Sports Business Conversations, Dave Almy. Dave, welcome to the program.
I'm so excited to be here. I can barely stand it. And I hopefully don't run the video because I'm like rocking back and forth. Like I'm going from foot to foot. I'm so psyched to be here. Thanks, Ross. Good to see you, man.
Good to see you too. No, we're just doing audio for this one. And yeah, I was going to ask you, dude, are you ready for this one? I don't know if I'm ready for this one. It's pretty early on, but if you're not first, you're last.
I think for a lot of people, this movie is sort of foundational to their whole like sponsorship perspective, right? This kind of is
I know
the perfect mix of pop culture and incredible, like you said, the dark art and wizardry associated with sponsorships. So, I mean, I'm hanging on by the skin of my teeth here, man. This is going to be exciting.
All right. Well, let's get into it. The year is 2006. The deal is Fig Newton's Windshield sponsorship of Dennett Racing's number 26 Nextel Cup Series stock car. The film is Talladega Nights, The Ballad of Ricky Bobby, and this is False Market Value. You want to do the line?
What is it? This windscreen is incredibly dangerous, but I sure do love Fig Newtons.
Yeah, Ricky Bobby, who never met a sponsor he didn't like, sold the windshield. All right. So to give a little bit of background, you had mentioned earlier, industry professionals' perspective of what sponsorship can be influenced by this deal in particular. And honestly, I think having rewatched it last night, actually with my wife, who quotes this on a weekly basis, I would say.
It's so quotable.
Oh my God. I mean, there's all sorts that we didn't even realize that were coming from this particular film. My wife even asked me, she said, "Oh, is that what this is from?" I don't even remember what I'm quoting anymore because it's so been ingrained into our daily vernacular.
I kind of feel like we should refer to each other as shake and bake throughout the rest of the podcast.
I think we should. That's right. If you smell a crispy smell coming from the oven, should we just do Line-O-Rama now and get all those out of the way?
It's almost impossible. They're going to infuse this entire conversation. It's impossible not to. Right?
It's going to keep coming back. I think it's unavoidable. So Talladega Nights, released in 2006, the film that launched 1,000 Halloween costumes. Did you ever go as Ricky Bobby for Halloween?
I don't have to go as Ricky Bobby for Halloween because I feel like there's a part of me that just tries to embody the character on a day-to-day basis. This isn't sort of like I'm waiting once a year kind of thing. This is something that, his willingness to engage with his sponsors, integrate them into his daily life. Like I can't remember which flavor Powerade was at the family dinner. I think it was they were waiting for the release of Mystic Mountain Blueberry over the course of that. Like that day-to-day existence.
Super cool on a hot summer day.
Yeah, that day-to-day Ricky Bobby experience in this industry is something that we should all aspire to, Ross. It's not just a Halloween thing.
I agree. I think the commitment's great. And I have a couple notes on some of the things that he does that are just above and beyond. I mean, his sponsors have to be happy. So aside from the Halloween costumes, I just learned this. I mean, I think it's either last weekend or this weekend. So NASCAR still pays tribute to the film. So there's...
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, they have... So Ryan Preece and Chase Briscoe are running the Wonder Bread and the Old Spice livery at the Yellowwood 500 race. And so they both race for Stuart Haas Racing. And so Wonder Bread and Old Spice are actually sponsors just for that weekend and have associated sponsorship benefits. And they say in some of the research, Wonder Bread, their parent company wasn't really in 2006 involved in NASCAR at all. And they, Adam McKay and Will Ferrell had to lobby pretty hard to get them to agree to be in the film and use their logo because Adam McKay in particular thought it was hilarious, who wrote the script.
I think it's such an interesting point, right? Because the film came out when NASCAR had experienced its apogee of popularity, right? It had been...
Oh, it was the hype.
It had been red freaking hot, right? But This was clearly everybody understood the potential for NASCAR and sponsorship, what it could do for a brand at that point. But
Yep.
you can imagine how a brand would be like, okay, well, we're going to do this film about NASCAR. It's going to star Will Ferrell.
Yep.
It's going to have the Perrier car be the villain. We want to integrate your brand into it. If you're a brand manager, it takes a level of stepping out onto the ledge in order to understand the potential of what that could do, right?
Yep. And they say that so that LA Times article that I sent to you dating back to 06. So they said they brought in 24, so let's say 24 different brand managers from a variety of brands they wanted to feature in the film and did that very thing. They brought in the brand reps and pitched what they wanted to do and gave them it sounds like it gave them a look at the script and said, this is where we see you fitting in. And they worked with the managers directly to try and get that to be organic as part of the experience. And initially I think I had said to you, or I had shared with you, that I was surprised that Kraft signed off on Fig Newton, because the brand manager for Kraft said it was already in the script and our Fig Newton brand team signed off on it. And then she said, when we look at product placement overall, we want something that illustrates the iconic status of our products.
And nothing, what's more iconic than being on the windshield of a car?
Yeah, aside from him saying this is extremely dangerous, but man, I love Fig Newtons. It didn't seem like that was the best fit, but it was also, like you said, the height of their popularity, and everybody wanted into that sport. And when we look at how we would have valued this, which I had some experience doing this around that time, and then how we would do it now, it sounds like in terms of assets, and we'll get into that, hasn't really changed much. A race being a race, a car being a car, a team being a team, the pit being the pit, all that seems pretty consistent to what I saw when I was valuing some of this for some of these teams back around that time period, 05, 06. But I don't think the same sentiment from brands, at least from what I've read, toward NASCAR in particular, because Formula One is gaining popularity. It looks like, and there's some research to show, that the amount of brands, at least from the Fortune 500, has changed over the years, and the fan base has shrunk slightly. And a lot of that started, it appears, in 08 during the financial crisis. So that seems to have changed from how we would have done this then to how it would be done now. And even the primary car sponsorships have changed.
It's funny. I had an opportunity to do some work with the American Automobile Association when they were evaluating a NASCAR team sponsorship with Roush. It was the Mark Martin car, the number 6 car, back around 2000, 2001. And, again, it was at the height of popularity. So it was, even then, impossibly expensive, right? It was like, I think those deals were like, if you're going to be the primary sponsor on a NASCAR, it was $24 million for each racing year. And then, then that doesn't, then also, if the team wins, right, there's a bonus that's paid to the driver and the team for every win on behalf of the sponsor, and all those things are integrated into it. So you had to take into account the incredible expense associated with it. The other things that we had to take into account were, of course, going back to the safety thing, you had to think about Fig Newtons slapped on the windscreen of the car and kind of laugh about it. But this was AAA insurance, and there was this kind of disconnect between, okay, you're talking about driving safely and rewarding drivers for driving safely, and you're going to slap your logo on the side of a NASCAR where if you're not rubbing, you're not, racing kind of stuff. From a brand fit, that was something that we took a long, hard look at, and, try to figure out how that would make sense for an insurance brand. So, kudos to the Fig Newtons people. They grabbed that tiger by the tail and they ran with it. I think it's mixing like 6 different metaphors, but you get my meaning.
I think you're right. And I agree. And there's a note about how their brand is portrayed during that scene in particular, which I never noticed until I rewatched this again last night. I had a similar experience. It wasn't with Roush, but I worked with Joe Gibbs Racing. So when I was working at IEG, Joe Gibbs Racing, specifically the Tony Stewart and the Denny Hamlin car at the time, we were valuing going into the 2006 season. And there were a couple different things that we looked at, and that speaks to the assets a little bit. So Tony was driving the Home Depot car at the time. That was his primary sponsor. And he actually won the Nextel Series in 05. So he was coming off a big win and had a lot of exposure, not only from that, but you may remember this. When he won the Cup, he jumped out of his car, sprinted across the track and climbed the fence. And his sponsor, Home Depot, latched onto that in terms of congruency or fit and said, "Hey, Tony, we sell ladders." And they ran an ad that they sent out to everywhere, tying into that moment where he climbed the fence. And then he sort of became associated with that through the rest of his career about, Tony Stewart isn't climbing any fences this weekend if he didn't win a race. And then Denny Hamlin in '06 won Rookie of the Year. And he was driving the FedEx car. And so the FedEx sponsorship went away quite recently, actually. And I think I've got the exact date somewhere. But that era for Joe Gibbs Racing was especially valuable. And I remember going through and looking at a couple different things for them. It wasn't just the primary car sponsorship, which were, Home Depot and FedEx for both of those cars. We were looking at the fender. We're looking at the lower rear quarter panel. And then I'm pretty sure it was either the B post or the C post that we valued. And fortunately now, for people that are tuning in and listening to this, a lot of the information about those types of deals and what sponsors pay for them, it's a lot more transparent than we were doing this at the time. And in fact, Joe Gibbs Racing didn't even tell me what their sponsors were actually paying. They wanted us to value it somewhat in a vacuum, where it was just, what's the gross exposure value from all these different things that we do. And we were coming in, it was actually the extension of a contract. So when I started at IEG, they had been working with them for, I think, 4 years beforehand. They'd renewed for another 4. So we started going into the 2006 season. And I can tell you from looking at some of the research that the values that are being published seem to be pretty consistent, and as did the fee that you just mentioned, especially for one of the drivers. And I'm never entirely certain what I can and can't share from working with those projects, but I can say that the values you mentioned aren't unreasonable.
How long does that NDA last anyway?
I don't know. But just to be fair, I won't say who did what or who paid what.
The lawyer.
But I can say it's within the ranges that have been published, and I think that's pretty true for any NASCAR primary sponsorship.
And I think this is one of the things, frankly, that is super challenging about NASCAR, and it's super challenging for a lot of different properties, but NASCAR in particular, because the way the sports finances are based on sponsorship, right? For the teams, right? They don't get money from ticket sales. They don't get money from any of that. Their revenue comes from partners, right? And that's actually one of the draws when they go out to try to sell someone in. It's like, our fans love our partners, because without them, their favorite teams don't race. And that's the positive. The challenge is that pie is carved so narrowly, right? You have, to your point, you have all the different placements just on the car. But then, the driver has his own or her own partnerships. Then the track has their own partnerships. And then the organizing body, NASCAR, has their own partnerships. And of course, the media player, my partners, have their own partnerships. So when you're trying to value it from a brand, you really have this incredible challenge of looking at this soup, maybe more appropriately a stew, of people who are all fighting for attention, which is why, you try to spend at the highest level that you're comfortable with, just in order to stand out that little bit.
Yep. Well, that's a good segue into, let's call it our first category. In our industry, Dave, we'll call that the degree of sponsor clutter. But here at False Market Value, we'll call it logo soup.
Logo soup. We'll call it logo stew. Thank you. Coined. That's false sponsorship value, copyright 2023.
So what I usually like to do here is go through, which brands are real and which brands are fake. Specifically, the fake brands tend to be the fun ones, and there's a pretty obvious one, especially from early on in the film. But in this case, there were so many brands that were recognized, I stopped keeping track in
crazy.
5 minutes. And I just focused on the fake ones, or the ones that at least I thought were faked. And then I went back and went to see if they were made up or not. Some of them were a few surprises. There were a couple on the front fender that I didn't recognize. And that was a question my wife had. She said, are those all real brands? And there were a couple I hadn't heard of, but those are generally the endemic brands.
Yeah, the super duper internal racing brands, right?
That are in the car, the oil company.
Yeah, the oil companies, and then the spark plug cleaning systems.
Yep. There's a chassis logo. I think it's not chassis, pistons, JE Pistons, which is a company I hadn't heard of, but within
total deal.
NASCAR.
For real deal.
Yeah. Yep.
But I think that goes back, this is the genius of the movie, right? The genius of the movie is that it wasn't created in a vacuum. This was done in partnership with NASCAR. So, all those things carried over, and I'm sure there, was agreement right out of the front end to make sure that their endemic sponsors and their league sponsors were appropriately included into this. But that's also the genius of the movie too, because it doesn't avoid the marketing question. It leans into the marketing piece of NASCAR because it is so baked in, right? If you try to avoid the sponsorship discussion in that movie, it would ring as false. So, I mean, that's why that whole dinner scene kind of, you laugh about it. We talked about Mystic Mountain Blueberry earlier, but
it's one of my favorite parts of the movie.
It's one of the best. Like, Will Ferrell's doing the family prayer, and he talks about, the bountiful harvest of Domino's, KFC, and the always delicious Taco Bell. Right? Pretty much everybody's family dinner in the NASCAR world.
So, call back to your comment about the Powerade sponsorship and the required verbal mention as part of his endorsement deal with Powerade, and talking about enjoying it on a hot, cool day, and it's the Mountain Berry Blast or whatever it is they're promoting for the summer. There, with regard to verisimilitude, there's some truth to that, not to that extent, but one of the brands I worked with, you mentioned AAA, was Anheuser-Busch. And one of the rules, if you're working for, definitely consulting with, also part of just the deal with consulting with a beverage brand, is you could drink whatever you wanted. If you went out to lunch and you went out with all the executives, anybody can drink whatever they want, but you order a Budweiser and you put it on the table before any of the food or any of the beer or any of the other drinks come out. That's the rule if you work or consult with Anheuser-Busch or any of the beverage companies. And the Powerade tag, the verbal mention, makes me laugh every time I watch that film, because it hews close to the truth. It's not that dramatic, but it's a real thing. It's brand protection.
I did some work with Diageo not a bunch of years ago, now that I think about it. And they had a similar thing at Anheuser-Busch, right? You don't have to drink it, but you got to order it.
It's got to be on the table
at lunch, right? You have to order it.
Yep.
They will pay for a cab from anywhere to anywhere if you've been drinking at lunch or dinner or something like that. And if you get popped for DOI, you're fired the next day.
Yeah.
That's the way those companies work, right? You go back to brand protection and things like that. That's absolutely how they work and how they're set up.
And I think Ricky Bobby's maybe the best example you'll ever see on film of sponsor protection.
Oh my God.
I mean, he is loyal to a fault to all the sponsors, and they mention that as they're going through, hence the Fig Newtons deal that we're talking about, by request, I might add. So I'm happy we're doing this. I
guess I also was at war with myself. I'm gonna be honest with you, Ross, because the Fig Newton is the one that stands out the most because it's such an iconic moment in the movie and in sponsorship. Like, everybody's always looking for what's the camera angle and where can we find something that's never been exploited before, or where can we figure out where the next placement is going to be, so that like dash across the windshield of the car is just such a great call out for people in the industry who kind of all probably went, oh yeah, if I could have done it, I absolutely would have asked to have the logo on the windscreen.
Yep.
But the other one so that's the one I want to focus on. But boy, I would love to talk to the Perrier brand managers.
Yeah. Who
signed on to have their car play what is effectively the villain car in the movie, with Sacha Baron Cohen playing, I can't remember the driver's name right off the top of my head. Do you have it on?
Jean Girard.
Jean Girard. Like, that character, so over the top, so like preposterously, ridiculously French, had such a possibility for not landing. Like that, like, okay, Old Spice and okay, Wonder Bread and okay, Fig Newtons, well done, but shout out to the Perrier folks on that one. That was a bold move.
Yeah, no shout out to the Laughing Clown malt liquor folks.
Well, since I'm enjoying a fine and tasty cup of Laughing Clown right now, I suppose I probably should make my mention.
So that one is obviously a creation from Adam McKay, who actually plays the driver that Ricky Bobby replaces Will Ferrell's character in the film, and drives for the first time on a NASCAR racetrack. But there is a brewery in Michigan that has created a malt liquor called Laughing Clown with a logo that's pretty similar, if not identical, to the film. And that's just part of their brand.
That's the other question. Who owns that IP now?
apparently, I would assume that there's a licensing relationship with whatever that smaller microbrewery is.
But if the logo has a slight derivation from it, maybe not. Interesting.
Maybe not.
Well, volume 2 of this podcast. The value of fake intellectual property, like Red Apple cigarettes and Quentin Tarantino.
No comment on that, but it may or may not be on the list of things we'd like to cover on this.
Sorry. No, this is where you plug a future episode.
No, this is great. That is, there's a handful of these, and it's worth noting. There's 50 years of NASCAR films, or more specifically, motorsports films that we can do. I've mentioned a couple to you that I think it'd be good that show how sponsorship has changed over the years. I think this is a good one too. I mean, the malt liquor one we're joking about, but Wonder Bread wasn't a brand that was involved in NASCAR at the time that this movie was made, but now they're participating in sponsoring the liveries that use their logo, recreating the cars from the film. And those are the types of brands that historically haven't been part of NASCAR, which, according to the Sports Business Journal, and when we post this, we might actually include that article because it includes a lot of good information that we're talking about now about how the sport has changed over the years and some history. But one of the things that they mention is that it's the challenger brands now that are being incorporated into NASCAR, and some of the major Fortune 500 brands are starting to shift over to Formula One, one of those being Jack Daniels, which is based in Tennessee. So good segue. Let's just talk about sort of how the industry has changed, because I think that's
I thought you meant segue like, let's drink some Jack Daniels.
Oh, if you got some, I unfortunately...
I just said I'm with Laughing Clown right now. I got to stay on brand.
Yeah. So we talked about the sports change. So in 2005 at the Daytona 500, 60%, this is according to the Sports Business Journal, 60% of primary sponsors on Cup Series cars were Fortune 500 brands. And in 2023, that had fallen to about 20%. And that started around 08 during the financial case. Yeah. And the total, if you go back to that LA Times article that I had shared, they had noted the fan count at 75 million. As of this summer, it's 67 million. So that's decreased slightly too. The other thing that's changed is, so according to NASCAR, 25% of the brands, so somewhere between 20 and 25% of brands in the Fortune 500 are still sponsors of NASCARs, where Jack Daniels is one that moved over to Formula One. So that's one of the things that's interesting in the film, speaking of Jean Girard, is he's brought into NASCAR as somewhat of a promotion. And now it seems like they're on equal footing. And so there are brands that are shifting from one to the other because Formula One's increasing in popularity while NASCAR declined and is starting to rebound. So they're changing the way that they're doing those deals. But with regard to fees, they're not structuring the sponsorships the same way that they used to. So instead of having one season, so we mentioned, Home Depot, you mentioned AAA, FedEx, they were season-long primary car sponsors, and they would buy the whole season, every single race, all 36.
Yeah, not anymore.
Now they're splitting that into thirds, and they, according to the Sports Business Journal, that started with Hendrick Motorsports with the number 48 cars. So Jimmy Johnson's car was the first one to split up the primary deal, the car sponsorship, into 2 or 3 other brands so that they could split the cost for the fees, because it seems like the cost of the sponsorship and the value it's receiving, especially as ad rates increase at 6+% every single year, especially for television networks, and if the audience is going down, the brands aren't seeing the same return for the investment that they did in its heyday of 05 to 08, and then they're starting to split up the costs and activate around it more, because the activation cost is something they note too for hospitality experiences. One of the things we looked at as part of those packages 15 years ago or longer were talent appearances. So they'd show up at events hosted by the sponsor, and then just activating at an event and bringing your own guests in is another, few $100,000s on top of it, depending on the side of the race, if you're doing that throughout. So the activation costs are increasing. So they're decreasing the recognition component of it and sort of rebalancing where they're getting the value from these deals, at least from what's been reported in some of the industry publications. I thought that was interesting.
And I think you also have to look at, there's certainly, everybody became following the height of NASCAR popularity and the cost associated with those partnerships.
Yep.
There had to be a decline at some point, but you also have to remember, right? We have to look at it in the context of that period of time too, because that thing also smacked right up against 2008 and the housing crisis, right? When the economy, for lack of a better term, it seems like forever ago, it's really not that long ago, the economy effectively cratered. And all kinds of marketing expenses were dramatically reduced. And that was for things in marketing that were considered foundational to any brand's responsibility for how they wanted to carry things out, like, the standard stuff like TV spots. So things like NASCAR, stadium title sponsorships, all those things were not only being evaluated much more closely. I mean, you had Barney Frank in the House of Representatives saying, like, what the hell are you doing, Citibank, sponsoring a stadium? No one, I think he even had a quote, like, nobody ever opened up a checking account because you had a name on a stadium.
Yep.
Right. Which was a bit of a hand to the forehead type moment if you're in this industry. But NASCAR wasn't.
There's a couple of quotes from the brand manager saying you can't really put a price on this stuff, and I read that and I say, well, yeah, you can.
Turns out
and in fact, I've done it. Pretty sure you can.
Yeah, I remember seeing a number associated with this, like Wonder Bread's value received in the week after the movie came out was $4.5 million. Right now, that was the week after the movie came out. So now extend that over, what are we, 17 years after the movie came out?
Yep.
I mean, with streaming and the way that things live in perpetuity now, that is almost impossible to calculate.
The ancillary repeated future coverage, Wonder Bread still getting recognized associated with that car, the Fig Newtons. I mean, even the liveries for the cars this past weekend, they mentioned it's everything but the Fig Newton logo on the windshield. That kind of recognition, it's really hard to measure because it's just organically happening. People tagging things, rise of social media, following the release of this movie. I can't imagine what that value would have been if they did release it today. And I maybe that's one of the key takeaways is that would have caught fire right away instead of, maybe YouTube or there wasn't a Twitter account that would have been dedicated to the film and had Will Ferrell and Adam McKay pushing that out on their account in 2006 that everyone would have latched onto. And the value for any of the brands in the movie for that reason would have been many multiple times over of even what you mentioned. And the film itself overperformed. I think they said it was budgeted, or at least they're hoping for 36 million in its opening weekend, and it did 45. I mean, adjusted for inflation, those numbers are huge now, 16, 17 years later. So everything overperformed.
And nary a superhero in it.
Right.
Well, Ricky Bobby's, I guess, sort of a superhero. He's sort of an anti-hero in his own sort of way. And that's
I actually want to come back to that.
That's also the genius of the movie, too, because you know how much those brands paid to be involved in the movie, right?
Go ahead and share.
Well, I mean, I've only found this out recently because you look at that and you figure, okay, well, NASCAR sponsorship is $20 million for the entire thing. So you kind of try to work off of that. Turns out they spent $0. Brands did not pay anything. They just made a media commitment to promote the movie. So
there you go. So everything was just gravy on top of that.
You think about the value that has brought to Wonder Bread and Old Spice and Powerade and ultimately Fig Newtons over the 17-year lifespan of the movie. It's all of a sudden you're looking at like the brand manager should be standing up on a podium and taking a bow. I mean, that's perpetual revenue.
Yeah. And that's a really great point. And we talk about this in an earlier podcast that we did about product placement. So it's important to distinguish, I suppose, between product placement, like the brands that were included in the films, and then in the fictional world of Ricky Bobby and, his racing team, what Laughing Clown Malt Liquor would have paid to be the primary sponsorship in that particular universe around that time. So we're sort of, blending the lines, and it's going to happen, especially when you're talking about real companies sponsoring fictional content. But one of the things we talked about is there are some brands that, depending on the time period in which the film was released, don't need to pay, like you said, to be integrated into a film like that. They just need, as it turns out, to review the script, approve how their marks are being used, and then get to participate in the promotion of it. There was one brand that used Will Ferrell to record a couple of spots. Nextel did, and then they pushed that out on their networks to generate some buzz. I think it was definitely YouTube around that time. So I agree with you. It suddenly looks like they were forward thinking and not investing anything and getting all of this additional, non-paid exposure, which adds value to NASCAR sponsorship. And that's one of the reasons why, just in general, companies want to invest not just in film properties like this, but in NASCAR, because someone listening to this might say, okay, $20 to $25 million for a primary car sponsorship, or, some of the research says 500 to $1 million up to 2 million per race, and there's 36 races a year. Do they really get the value out of that? And I had someone mention that to me recently too about English Premier League soccer, because some of those are 50 million pound a year deals. Do they really get the value out of it? All of that type of stuff that you're talking about that they get over the years for the association with the property goes way above and beyond anything that they would actually pay for. And that's where they start to see their return, especially for Fig Newtons in this case.
When you and I started in this business, there was social media wasn't even really a thing. And now it's one of the primary sources of value that goes into this. I mean, I think the last 2 projects I've done, the primary emphasis has been on what does it do on social media, not what it does on broadcast, because everybody knows that people aren't paying attention to broadcast anymore. People are looking away. People are second screening.
Yep.
They've got 4 different, videos running simultaneously on their own screen. So, anybody who thinks that 100% of the audience is sitting in front of an ad is paying attention to the ad is, clearly delusional. So
nope.
The social media offers that context, right? Also because the value is so much more intense, because it had to take the effort of the individual to put that piece on there. It was something they wanted to share. It was a moment that was specific and interesting enough to them. It wasn't passive, it was active. So we talk all the time, right? What's the benefit of sponsorship, right? Halo effect and engagement and, finding audiences of people who are passionate about something. That's where value for social media really stands out in comparison to some of the more passive pieces.
Yeah, and even in terms of valuation.
God, I got on my soapbox right there, didn't I?
Preach away. So the thing about social media too, especially early on, is I remember around that time period when, for example, Facebook took off, and I think MySpace was also a predominant medium at the time, or a social medium at the time, and that was starting to get integrated by brands in some of the things that we're looking at and valuing from valuation perspective. And there wasn't really a set of rules for valuing those like there are now, and we weren't looking at the total influence that you were buying when you're tying into social networks. And that's one of the things that I would advise anybody, if you're looking at social media value or you're pursuing sponsorship for the first time, get that report that shows where the sphere of influence goes. Because even if you're tagging 1,000 followers, it might be 10 times that you're actually reaching. I mean, I don't know about you, Dave, I get notifications from LinkedIn on how many impressions I get from a single post, and it's many multiples above just what my following audience is. And it's that.
All I know is true for everybody. My mom likes every single one of my posts.
Yep. That's great.
I was going to also mention that you said that I could plug away, so I'm going to plug away really quick because it did come up earlier. I did do a great podcast with Ashley Chalk she was at the time with Chip Ganassi Racing, and talking a lot about doing partnerships for IndyCar. And we talked about Formula One and, what's that done for NASCAR? Has it siphoned people away? Has it, siphoned more partners away from IndyCar and things like that? What's the impact been? And on my podcast, One-on-One Sports Business Conversations, she indicated that there has absolutely been a rising tide effect on all the sponsors that she had seen at that point. Now, she's not with Chip Ganassi anymore, but it also speaks to the continual reinvention of platforms for how sponsorships get distributed. Who would have ever thought? I mean, the values associated with what the Formula One partners are getting from Drive to Survive on Netflix is in the tens of millions, 20s, 30s millions of dollars in exposure just based on that documentary, which nobody saw coming.
Yeah. So just with regard to values, I want to run through this real quick, and then let's figure out what we think the false market value of this Fig Newtons deal would be. And I've got a quick anecdote that I'm gonna share that I found. I don't know if you saw this, but I'll send it to you after this actually. But so in terms of sponsorship, so title sponsorship to events, these are current values that are being shared by the 2 different sources. One, Sports Business Journal. The other one is a NASCAR publication. So title sponsorship.
You've been browsing the intertubes.
Yeah. Well, I want to give people, public resources, because a lot of this information's out there. And especially early on when I was starting in my valuation career, it wasn't easy to just, pull up what other teams are getting for sponsorship. It just wasn't reported that way. And there weren't as many publications, I don't think, at that time either, at least.
Oh, and it was tightly held.
Very much. And so that's loosened up a little bit, which I think is great. So if we can give those resources to generate some positive awareness for how this sport operates. And if NASCAR is being more transparent, I mean, the bigger the audience and platform we can give that, I think the better. So try and quote public resources where I can. So for this particular one, title sponsorship to events. So if you're naming an event, it's anywhere from $5 to $35 million annually. Primary sponsorship, like we talked about earlier, 500 to 200 million per race, or now that's down to about 10 to 20 million from those particular deals from their heyday of, anywhere from 20 to 25 up to 30 million a year. So that's decreased a little bit. Associate sponsors, so those are 50 to 500,000 was the range that they gave. That's lower quarter panels or the B or C posts that I mentioned. Then partnership deals, which are starting at 15,000 depending on the race, and then a product sponsorship. So those are the ones that showed up on. There's a great shot early in the film of the malt liquor car, and it's just the front fender, and it has all of those brands recognized. And I think that was intentional. It was sort of the hero shot of all of those brands above the tire. But those are where you start to see those endemic companies like we talked about earlier. So as it relates to Fig Newton, obviously they don't sell the windshield, which is the joke, but they bought it, what it sounds like is a single race. And so here's, did you find this deleted scene on YouTube? Have you seen this?
No, I don't think I have.
So there's a deleted scene about Fig Newtons, and Ricky Bobby walks into the garage when Lucius and team are slapping the sticker on the windshield. And apparently it was a deal his wife sold. And she said, "Hey, honey, I just did this deal. I got a sack full of cash, and we're going to put satellite TV on our boat." So I don't know how much, just for posterity, I went back to see how much did it cost to install satellite television, including a dish and all the stuff that you had to do back in the day before of DirecTV or even the prominence of cable and streaming platforms. So it looks like in the 90s it was around $3,000. In the 80s it was $10,000. Now it's about $1,000 if you had to install a satellite dish.
Terrible deal for the Fig Newtons placement.
Right. So I'm guessing
she must have had a very small bag to put that cash in,
or it was super expensive to install a satellite dish on a boat that was moving around trying to hit a satellite. That seems like that would be different.
You can't get cable on a boat.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that's a single sponsor race. He crashes.
Yeah, so I totally agree. Single sponsor race, because it's the only race in which that shows up.
Yeah, and it looks like it was just a cash grab, a literal cash grab.
They wanted satellite on the boat
as part of that race. Yep. And so the Charlotte Motor Speedway, formerly Lowe's Motor Speedway, which is where that infamous crash happens and the Fig Newton race is sold. So in 2006, in the actual Nextel Cup Series, there were 3 races that ran in May over a Saturday and Sunday. So the first is the Nextel Open. That was Saturday, the All-Star Challenge, and then Sunday night was the Coca-Cola 600. And those all happened over the same race weekend in Charlotte. And that would have been, in the context of the film, if this were a real race, when he would have crashed, when that Fig Newtons logo was on there. So all those things considered, in 06, single weekend sponsorship, call it, similar to what Wonder Bread is doing currently around, the Talladega Nights liveries. What would you think, just for that one race that Fig Newton would have paid to slap their logo on that? What's the bag of cash look like?
So we have to add some context here too, because we have to believe also that if they're going to do this, NASCAR has sanctioned the selling of the windscreen, right? Because if they showed up to the finish at the start line and they had that logo on there, so we're going to go with the assumption that NASCAR has permitted the selling of the windscreen, right? Because
fair enough.
Yep. In theory, we wouldn't be able to race the car. In theory, because you got a sticker on the thing that you can't see. Safety issue. But, NASCAR, always forward looking, wanting to find those extra spaces. So are we also then assuming, and Ross, I'll put this to you, are we also assuming then that the Ricky Bobby car is the only one with windshield sponsorship at this time?
That's a great question. And I love that you're truly approaching this like a valuation analyst, basing things on assumptions. I know. So I think we have to assume that they're the only ones to do this because of the ludicrousness
of it. So
of doing that. And Ricky Bobby, who never met a sponsor he wouldn't push, agrees to slap this logo on his windscreen.
So what we're talking about then is something that is wholly unique under the sun, particularly in terms of racing. It would be the subject of incalculable media speculation. It would be on the front page of every newspaper / sports section, particularly after the crash. Like, why would NASCAR ever allow this to happen? So if the racing team was going to solicit a partnership for it, the value would be so, I would say it's going to be higher than a team sponsorship.
You think so? Just from the potential of attracting all those eyeballs just that one weekend?
It's never been done before. They're absolutely putting the driver at risk for brand exposure. It's something that has never been done before, so it has that unique factor. Everybody's going to be paying attention to it. So while maybe not, all right, maybe I'll backtrack a little bit. So let's just say if a team sponsorship, we're talking about 2006 or are we talking about 2023?
Let's do both.
All right, 2000. So we figure like a team sponsorship would be $25 million back in the day. That would be a $10 million one-off sponsorship. Right, if you
just to slap their logo on
the logo on there, because there's no way you're taking any less and you're putting your driver at risk for that kind of thing. And it would be so unprecedented that everybody would understand how much attention that it would get.
It would be on the cover of any newspaper covering NASCAR the next morning.
Right.
That would be above the fold on the newspaper, a shot of him wherever he is, wherever that car is in line, with the Fig Newtons on there saying NASCAR's crossed the line or Ricky Bobby crosses a line or whatever the case is.
Weeks, but that every sports talk show would be talking about nothing but Fig Newtons. How do they ad ages, cover would be going into the Fig Newton decision, and how that came to be, that kind of thing. Like it would be the zeitgeist. And I get to use the word zeitgeist because you used the word verisimilitude earlier. I can't even say it. And that's like a $57 word, Ross Kennerly. How dare you?
We'll add it to our future sponsor costs for this program.
So, anything in the sponsor world that is unprecedented, has never been done before. Think of like the Red Bull jump from space. It's never been done before.
Yeah.
It's going to capture attention. It may not be forever, but it's certainly going to be that moment in time.
Well, and I think that was guaranteed regardless of the outcome of the race. What if he had won? I mean, he won a race in reverse. It stands to reason he could have won a race where in this outtake, he jokes that, I can see through my left eye through the logo. I can see the left side of the track at least. Like, it'll be fine.
Yeah. And
then he gets in the car and takes off because he honestly thinks he can win with that on there. And it stands to reason he could. He won a race in reverse, and then at the end of the film, won a foot race after his car
crashed.
Right.
I mean, so as preposterous as it seems to have a logo across the windscreen of your car, we are talking about Ricky Bobby here. He's a singular talent.
Yep. He was the best NASCAR driver at that time. So given the way that you positioned that initially, when I was sort of going through this, I was thinking, this is just a one-off deal over a weekend and it's a bigger race. So I was going to bump up some of that low end a little bit, but you've changed my mind, because now I'm thinking that would be what happened. It'd be a 2-week news cycle of
nothing but,
can you believe that they did this? It would be on SportsCenter on ESPN in 2006, running at the top of the hour. It'd be the first story on there, and they would talk about it all week. It'd be content for weeks.
Who's the best hitter in baseball right now, right? It would be equivalent to the best hitter in baseball having a blindfold across their eyes when they're at bat with a logo on it. Like, you would never stop talking. Big idea for baseball.
At the height of the popularity of the sport too. So yeah, I'm going to agree with you, because I think everything that you just outlined, if you go through the assumptions and you lay them out that way, and this is how we do valuation projects, right? It's all based on assumptions. So I think that all makes sense. It's justifiable.
How did you start the conversation, right? It's the dark art, right? And you and I start every bloody conversation we have on this topic. Like, look, we're going to put as much science in this as we possibly can, but there's always going to be a little art and magic that goes along with this, just based on experience and what we've seen and what you expect.
Yeah. Any takeaways that we haven't already covered off on? I think we touched on some big ones, just in differences between how you would do this then and how you would do this now, how sponsorship has changed over time, how they're doing, especially the bigger deals in NASCAR now, the advent of Formula One and other competition from sponsorship sellers in the market. What else would you have?
Can you imagine Ricky Bobby in a social media environment?
Yes.
I mean, every partner in the world. This has actually been the biggest change for me in thinking about the context of 2006 versus 2023 is that back in those days, people rooted for teams, whether that's a stick and ball team or whether that's a race team. But social media has totally changed that paradigm where people are more, particularly younger people, are more fans and associated with the athletes, right? Because the athletes have a presence, right? Athletes have the human side of social media that teams can just never touch. And so that's where connectivity lies now. So if Ricky Bobby existed today, that entire dinner scene would have been live streamed to an audience, and would have been looking at his wife holding the phone while they were on Instagram doing a live stream promoting brands. He would be a always on promotional machine. He would have sunglasses. His windscreen would be his sunglasses with Fig Newtons across his eyes.
Yep. He would have been the first Instagram personalities that was promoting brands on there. And I know, especially early on, before they had to change the sponsor designations and identify what a sponsored ad wasn't, or what type of communication is a sponsored post versus just their own post, because the lines are sort of blurred early on. He would have been an early adopter for that, just given his ability to promote and his willingness to just pitch any of his endorsements or sponsors and give them plugs. He would have been all over social media. He would have been a hot property. He would have had 40 sponsors.
And a wife always looking for that next bag of cash.
Yep. Looking for that bag of cash. All right. So just one last thought, and you might know where I'm going with this, just to end on food for thought. Looking at the very end of the film. Okay. So I read a book once called The Wisdom of Insecurity. And it was written by a guy called Alan Watts, who is a Westerner, meaning I think he's American, as an example, in terms of philosophy. And he had become, almost a Buddhist monk. He was a Zen master, and he wrote this book about living in the present moment. And one of the things that he had said is that there's the I that's yourself that is judging the acting of the me, which is your natural self, which is just going about doing your daily life. And then the I is constantly judging the decisions that you're making. And that's what's leading to a lot of anxiety for a lot of people, is that the identity, or, the idea of yourself and what's a good decision and what's a bad decision, which is the opposite of Eastern philosophy, which is those are all the same thing. They're one and the same. The person that's doing the acting and the person that's judging you, it's all you. And they've shown, and science
People
has shown.
Listening to this podcast did not see this coming.
Well, we like to keep you on your toes.
We're covering a lot of ground here.
Yeah. So where I'm going with that is, at the end of the film, he drives a car sponsored by me, and
the Cougar,
with the Cougar on it, the Cougar livery with the me sponsorship, and he even says, "What's in me?" And they said, "Well, out there, it's just you." And at the end of the film, he talks to his dad, and his dad says, "Who are you driving for out there?" And he's like, "I don't know. I just went out there and just drove." So, using that philosophy by that measure, was this the most Western example of corporate sponsorship maybe ever? Has it ever been topped? It really is. It's me driving the me car. There is no I involved. I think that's a very Zen moment to land on for this film. To your point earlier about him being an anti-hero, I think he's a Zen master by the end of the film.
He's a Zen master. Let's go back to what we just talked about social media. Maybe this is him crossing the bridge to understanding where the power really rested. In the individual, in the self, right? That's where the value is ultimately going to be for Ricky Bobby.
Yep.
So Zen master, marketing genius, a Western example of philosophical intent. I'm not going to answer that question, Ross. We're going to leave that to the listeners. I cannot wait to see your inbox blow up with those kinds of insights.
We will hope. So great note to end on. Dave, anything else you wanted to add before we wrapped up? I know you talked about the one-on-one podcast. Do you have anything coming up in the next couple of months that you wanted to mention before we wrap up?
Well, we've had just released one today, as a matter of fact, with Solly Fulp from Learfield, talking all about name, image, likeness, which is a rabbit hole of a high order. So trying to bring some sense to what's going on there. And we've got some interesting brand conversations coming up. We just did one with Zappos and the folks Megan Sheffield of Zappos, who are sponsoring the Savannah Bananas.
Yep.
Talk about an interesting topic, right? The blending of sport and entertainment. That's a pretty interesting piece there. So yeah, lots of fun content over there. And of course, the business over at ADC Partners continues to thrive as well. So I'm hopeful that means that you and I are going to have an opportunity to do some shenanigans together up here in the not too distant future and helping try to suss out these kinds of questions for clients in the near future.
I look forward to that. So thanks again, Dave, for joining our discussion today. It's great to have you on the program. I look forward to listening to the podcast and potentially collaborating in the near future. This has been False Market Value. My name is Ross Kennerly, founder of Quant Sponsorship Consulting. This episode has been produced by DJ Cruiser and KSD Studios out of Fort Mill, South Carolina. Dave, pleasure having you on the program. Look forward to doing the next one.
Thanks, Ross.
And we'll see you all next time.